IFRC. Very happy to be doing the opening remarks. Our session today is our Ignite panel. So this is a session in which we step back in an effort to burst our own daily shelter bubble and want to be challenged and inspired. We want to broaden our vision and deepen our critical thinking so that we can actually question our place, relevance, and contribution to the system that we are a small part of. So this is that's why one of the most inspiring and broadening sessions of our annual meeting. And we are honored to welcome a very distinguished and high-level panel today with the presence of Ms. Aditi Maheshwari, who's the Director of Climate Action at the Office of the UN Secretary General. Then secondly, Ms. Sosha O'Callaghan. She's the Director of the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. And if we are lucky towards the end, maybe we will be joined by Ms. Metsi Maketa. She's the UN Resident Coordinator in Burkina Faso. So the impressive CVs of our panelists can be found at the event link. I think we will post the link in a minute in the chat. And of course, the conversation between our panelists today will be moderated by our very own Mr. Brett Moore, the Global Shelter Cluster Coordinator on behalf of UNHCR. So I know that, of course, the main part of the session is to hear from our panelists, not from me, and to get their insights. So we will immediately move to the panel following a couple of house rules. So we want to benefit as much as possible from their presence. So interaction will be key. And for this purpose, we will be using a tool called Easy Retro. I will just put the link in there. So this is a tool that will enable us to ask questions to each panelist. And you will be able to vote on which question you like. So please look at the questions that are already there. And if you have any of them you like specifically, please vote on it, because we will be asking the questions that get the highest votes and of course have the most critical relevance. So there'll be a little bit of moderating on our end. But you're also able to make comments. So you might have a comment to make, but not necessarily a question. So you will be able to put it in this tool as well. It's very easy to use. So please take a look while I'm going through the house rules. We will be in the high numbers today. So please, microphones on mute, of course, unless you're speaking. And please turn on your camera if you're speaking and if you get the floor also to ask a question. We might have time at the end maybe for a couple of questions immediately from you if you don't have the chance to work with the tool or something else happens. So we will continue the discussion until 3:25 and wrap up with some closing remarks and the next steps for our annual meeting. So without further ado, then I will hand over to Brett for the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ella, for the introduction, and welcome again to our panelists and welcome to everyone online. I'll just take a couple of moments to set the scene before I introduce our first speaker. As Ella mentioned, the Ignite session has been a real highlight for us in the last couple of years. We began about 4 years ago, and this session is important because it gives our participants an opportunity to listen to specialists in related fields who have deep experience and are in positions of leadership where they can bring insight and create connections to the issues that the shelter cluster stakeholders are focusing on. And this year, the focus of our meeting, as we know, is shelter in a changing environment. And we deliberately chose the wording of this theme to give space to dual situations we're facing, from challenges in the humanitarian system and increased emphasis on development cooperation to system-wide moves to address climate change and take action in our own sphere of influence. But fundamentally, as shelter coordinators and as shelter practitioners, we focus our work on crisis-affected people and their physical living conditions. The period before and after the crisis are of critical importance for how we work also. As a cluster and with our partner agencies, we've made steps in the last few years to examine our current humanitarian shelter approaches and find new, better, and more environmentally friendly ways of implementing, which we're referring to as greening the response. We have donor support from BHA and ECHO for a series of activities focusing on this, and that will scale up in the next couple of years from now onward. More special session for that on Monday. I won't go into any more detail now on greening the response. Today's session will focus more on the big picture to help us see our work as part of a larger, interrelated system and think of ways to reframe, connect, advocate, and build our collective approaches for greater and higher level incremental change. Looking at the theme of our meeting, from both aspects of change, we have the privilege today to hopefully have all three panelists, all women with vast expertise. Firstly, we have Aditi Maheshwari, Director of Climate Action Team in the Executive Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations based in New York. Secondly, Saoirse O'Callaghan, who's the Director of Policy at ODI, the Overseas Development Institute, a think tank based in the UK. And hopefully our third speaker, Metsi Maketa, who's the resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator in Burkina Faso, will be able to join us, and then we'll focus on some country-specific contexts. So without any further ado, we'll go straight to the first speaker. Aditi, if you could please turn your camera on, and welcome, thank you very much. So Aditi, welcome and thanks. When reading your bio, I wanted to highlight a few of the most relevant aspects of your experience for our audience. I see you've had extensive experience with the International Finance Corporation in financing of green approaches and particularly buildings and infrastructure. Now with your role in the UN, you have a broad perspective across all domains, from humanitarian development, peace building. If you can let us know a bit more about your current role and your focus, and from your perspective, how does climate change drive and exacerbate humanitarian crises? And what role can humanitarians have in light of climate change issues? Thanks, Aditi. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Brett, and thank you to you and colleagues for the opportunity to join this panel and to discuss the links between the Secretary General's climate strategy and the vital work of the Global Shelter Cluster. So as Brett mentioned, I'm joining you from the Secretary General's Climate Action Team. My role as Director of Climate Action is to lead stakeholder engagement to advance climate action in key sectors and deliver on coalitions and initiatives that were launched at the Climate Action Summit in 2019, prioritizing energy and industry transition, cities, transport, resilience, and nature-based solutions. And so putting this in the context of what, the climate priority overall. With less than 6 months to go to COP26 in Glasgow later this year, we really have no time to waste. The Secretary General has been calling for climate action and climate ambition and has 3 overarching priorities, and I will outline those for you. And he has been continuing to call for these and has been calling for them at all levels, including with the G7, the G20, and others, to sort of step up on ambition. And the first piece is keeping the 1.5-degree climate goal within the Paris Agreement within reach through a global emission reduction in emissions of 45% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels, and getting to net zero emissions by 2050. Every country, every city, every company, every industry needs to join this global Net Zero by 2050 coalition and follow up with concrete and credible near-term plans and pathways to achieve this long-term vision. And in the case of countries, this requires submitting enhanced, ambitious, nationally determined contributions, which are the primary vehicle for country commitments under the Paris Agreement. In addition, the Secretary General has been calling out for phasing out of coal by 2030 in OECD countries and 2040 everywhere else as the single most important step to meeting the Paris Agreement goals. And we know that we need no new investments in fossil fuel infrastructure. Second, he has been prioritizing and calling for securing a breakthrough on adaptation and resilience. And in particular, with donors and financial institutions committing fully 50% of all climate finance to be allocated and directed towards adaptation and resilience investments. And third, on climate finance, he's been calling for all financial flows, both public and private, to be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. In particular, he's been calling for developed countries to fulfill the commitment that they made to provide $100 billion per year in climate finance to developing countries. In addition, sort of pushing for the disclosure of climate-related financial risks to become mandatory everywhere. The good news is that over the past year, the political environment has improved. Last year, around this time, only 30% of global emissions were covered by net zero emissions targets. Today, countries representing 73% of global emissions have announced net zero targets by mid-century. And since the Climate Action Summit in 2019, 560 companies have joined the Business Ambition for 1.5 degrees Celsius campaign, representing a market capitalization of $13 trillion. This is the equivalent of the GDP of China. So the direction of travel is clear, but emissions continue to rise, and the climate impacts we are seeing today at just 1.2 degrees of warming give us a glimpse of what we will face in the future. 10 days ago, we began the Atlantic hurricane season. 5 consecutive years of Category 5 hurricanes in Central America and the Caribbean have upended lives and livelihoods, destroyed countless homes and vital infrastructure, and set back sustainable development for years. Last year, Hurricane Eta affected 7.1 million people in 10 countries and caused more than $5 billion in damage across Central America. Just 2 weeks later, Hurricane Iota caused an additional $1.3 billion in damage. And this is just one of the many types of climate disasters that we are seeing get more frequent and more severe. And while nations as a whole are at risk, urban areas and residents are disproportionately impacted. More than 700 million people, close to 10% of the global population, live in urban areas in low elevation coastal zones that are highly vulnerable to flooding and storm surge. Because these coastal cities are also places of economic opportunity, they are continuing to attract new residents, and with growth rates that are substantially higher than urban centers away from the coast. Nearly 1 in 4 urban residents globally also lives in a slum, where extremely high population density, poor housing quality, limited services, and lack of access to escape routes significantly compound their risk. Yet right now, at just 5% of climate finance, 5% of climate finance to cities is going towards adaptation and resilience. Because cities produce 70% of global emissions, which will increase as they continue to grow and expand, financing must support a low carbon built environment. But it has to be both low carbon and resilient, not one or the other. Climate projections show that we will see substantially worse impacts over the fairly near term, even if we can secure major emissions reductions. Last year, the IFRC estimated that the number of people in need of emergency assistance due to climate disasters could increase by 50% over the course of this decade. We cannot continue to leave countries and communities depending on increasingly scarce humanitarian response funding to deal with increasingly severe, frequent, and often predictable climate disasters. To face these threats, the Secretary General has called, as I mentioned, for this breakthrough on adaptation resilience, including the necessary 50% of climate finance being allocated to adaptation. Right now, we're falling far short of that target. Just 20% of climate finance goes to adaptation resilience, and only 14% and 2% to LDCs and small island developing states, respectively. So climate action is an arena where development and humanitarian work come together and can support this breakthrough. I'd like to focus on two broad areas in this regard: improving our data for risk assessment and early warning, and systematically using these data to spur investment that increase long-term resilience, including as part of the global recovery from the pandemic. So on better data for risk assessment and early warning, the Secretary General has called for climate risks to be integrated into all policymaking, investment decision-making, budgetary and procurement processes, particularly for infrastructure. And governments of developing countries must receive the necessary support and tools to achieve this. We're seeing that non-state actors continue to play an active role in developing new tools to assess and manage climate risks. One of the initiatives of the Secretary General's Climate Action Summit in 2019, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, is leading the way in driving a systemic shift that facilitates capital investment in resilient infrastructure. The coalition is developing a systemic resilience assessment tool for investments and investment plans with the aim of protecting economic and social value from physical climate risk. The private sector is also advancing this work through the development of a shared open access global resilience index that is going to be available by COP26. This GRI, this Global Resilience Index, will build on the global risk model developed by UNDRR, which is a probabilistic risk model for 7 natural hazards: earthquakes, riverine floods, tropical cyclones, tsunamis, wind, storm surge, and volcanic hazards, adding climate projections for hazard distributions looking forward out to 2100. This is substantially going to expand our understanding of the built environment exposed to a wide range of hazards, particularly in urban areas where these assets are concentrated. It has the potential to be an indispensable tool, providing a shared baseline approach, data and metrics for further application in the development, humanitarian, and community and financial sectors across both public, private, and academic domains. Secondly, investments in resilience. We need to use new data, new analysis, and new instruments for better decision-making and investments in resilience. This is why the Secretary General has called for the scaling up of existing catastrophe-triggered financial instruments, particularly regional risk pooling mechanisms such as the Africa Risk Capacity and the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, otherwise known as CRIF, which can generate the flow of capital needed to help countries to recover from disasters. Insurance facilities such as CRIF allow developing countries protected by insurance to receive quick payouts that allow them to build back better and stronger after extreme weather events or natural hazards, thereby enhancing their resilience. We also need to strengthen ex-ante resilience building with support from donors, multilateral development banks, and other institutions, whether by developing and expanding the coverage of early warning systems, utilizing forecast-based financing models, or impact-based forecasting. The Global Center for Adaptation has found that even 24 hours of warning of a coming storm or heat wave can cut the ensuing damage by 30%, and spending $800 million on such systems in developing countries would avoid losses of between $3 to $16 billion per year. That's a huge saving. We've already witnessed the humanitarian community's response to the 2019 flooding in Bangladesh, which showed the effectiveness of early warning systems in driving anticipatory action, particularly in poor and vulnerable communities. Not only can it save lives, but it can also really reduce asset loss in urban settings. For example, in Bangladesh, the average asset loss for those affected by floods dropped by 27%. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on reducing the UN's own emissions and footprint. And I'd like to say that as we advocate for member states, companies, and cities all over the world to reduce their climate environmental footprint, we also need to do the same for ours. Humanitarian action is one of the largest drivers of the UN's emissions and environmental degradation, a natural consequence of attempting to get supplies to those most in need as quickly as possible to save lives. But in the sustainability strategy, the UN committed to reducing emissions in line with 1.5 degrees, which globally means 45% by 2030 against a 2010 baseline. And while the burden of this cannot be borne solely by humanitarian action, we also cannot meet this target without reducing the footprint of humanitarian action. And I understand that there are many with engineering, architecture, and logistic knowledge and experience that are listening in today and supporting housing for displaced populations in humanitarian settings. As you apply your knowledge and experience to support more resilient and efficient housing for beneficiaries, hopefully you can also bring solutions to reduce the climate and environmental footprint of this essential work. And thank you, and I look forward to hearing more from Saoirse and others.
Dear Aditi, thank you so much. That was fascinating and full of information and a lot for us to think through. I'll encourage all our participants to include comments on the link provided in the chat. That's where we're gathering all our comments and feedback. I noticed a couple of key headline things there really around COP3, around the commitment in terms of the $13 trillion that's already been capitalised, and key aspects for us as humanitarian response becomes urbanised, and we see that in our response. We know that there's 70% of the emissions are coming from cities, and that there's a lot more work that can be done to support resilience building up front, particularly in urban areas. We'll come to some questions around that later, and maybe more particularly around potential inputs for humanitarian actors on the things that you've outlined there. Aditi, thank you. I'll cross over to Saoirse now. Saoirse, thanks again for being available, and it's a pleasure to have you as part of this meeting. Saoirse, in your role in ODI as Director of Policy and your past experience in East Africa, maybe just begin by telling us what are the key issues you're looking at, and what do you think have been some of the improvements in terms of your research and policy perspective, but then still some of the gaps, maybe since the World Humanitarian Summit, and what does this mean for how we approach our work? Thanks, Saoirse.
Hi, Brett, and hello, Aditi, and hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm in the office today in London, I was saying, with Brett for the first time ever. So it feels like there's movement on that. And I'm just, feeling very positive, hopefully, about things improving over the future. I mean, the World Humanitarian Summit and progress on that. Well, I'm the director of the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI, and it's our pain and pleasure every year to do an annual review of the Grand Bargain, which is the main kind of instrument and the main commitment that emerged out of the World Humanitarian Summit. And it's had 11 different work streams that together were focused on improving the efficiency and the effectiveness of humanitarian action. And it's been 5 years now since the World Humanitarian Summit, and we have, and I actually posted in the chat, it might be interesting. We've just published HPG's, Humanitarian Policy Groups. Oh, I can't send chats. We've just published the 5-year report, and so maybe just starting with the headlines from that. I mean, I guess, it's a huge report. It's over 100 pages. And I think if you look at where the progress has been, I think it really depends on where you start. So I think when I came out of the World Humanitarian Summit, it was a real moment of coming together where there was huge activism around local humanitarian action, huge activism around disability and crisis, ending need, preventing as well as addressing conflict. And what emerged out of that kind of big moment where, it was the biggest, not only the first humanitarian summit in effect ever, but it was the biggest UN meeting ever. So it was a huge moment of optimism. And then out of that, we got this quite narrow, quite technical process that was the Grand Bargain, with its 11 different commitments, including things like harmonizing reporting. And I think that in itself was a little bit disappointing. And so if we're judging where we've come after 5 years to that moment of optimism around the World Humanitarian Summit, I think we definitely have failed, and we haven't transformed the humanitarian system into something that is, more equal, more open, more effective. But I do think that the Grand Bargain has had some successes. And for me, it's very much a reform process through negotiation, not a process of rapid transformation. And it's a unique forum, and it's the only one where humanitarian donors, where international, for UN agencies, NGOs and national organizations negotiate and decide as relative equals. And this, this is its strength, but it's also its limits. And so with the vested interests of 63 of the world's most powerful humanitarian agencies, they were never going to vote to completely upend the traditional aid system, and certainly not in 5 years. But if we look at where we've come, the big advance has been on cash. And for cash, the conditions were right. So at the World Humanitarian Summit, the case had already been made. There was 10 years of evidence, including by the Humanitarian Policy Group, but many others, arguing that cash was more dignified, it gave people more choice, that it worked in conflict settings. And I know cash is obviously a key instrument for the shelter cluster and for shelter solutions. But over, we see in 2019 that the total amount of assistance, humanitarian assistance given by cash is 17.9%, and that's up from 10% in just 4 years. Over this time, advances have also been made on local humanitarian action. When the Grand Bargain was signed, I think this was really an aspiration. Now it's either seen as, definitely on the table and very important by many, or just inevitable, I guess, from those actors, largely international actors, who are not giving way. There's still major blockages, particularly in terms of local leadership, decision-making, and access to quality funding. And then some of the more less successful areas. Participation has been an area, we talked in 2016 about a participation revolution, so that aid would reflect better what people in crisis need and want. But we've seen after 5 years that, assistance hasn't become more demand driven. And, I would argue the Emergency Relief Coordinator recently put a proposal together for more work on accountability and participation. But I think that agencies do need to be compelled rather than encouraged to listen and act on what people say. The incentives are all, existing in the wrong way. We're more accountable to donors rather than to what people on the ground need. So I'll stop there. I could talk at length about the Grand Bargain, but there are meetings next week that will, discuss the 5-year progress, but will also talk about the new iteration of the Grand Bargain 2.0, as it's been called. And this 2-year process is likely to focus on quality funding, localization and participation. And I think, they're the right issues to focus on, but there needs to be much more political engagement. This needs to be seen as a political negotiation between the big agencies, between donors, between aid actors, and not a technical process. If we really do want to transform the system, it needs to be recognised as such.
Thank you, Saoirse, for the overview. Much appreciated. That was very enlightening, and I think many of our colleagues online, but the participants are very familiar with grand bargain commitments, because, as you rightly outlined, for many of us, it defines our agency priorities, it defines donor priorities, albeit with significant gaps in progress. I noted then that you mentioned at least some of the successes have been around cash. And even in the cluster, we've made, great leaps forward in the last couple of years for really comprehensive cash guidance. And, around half of the humanitarian funding now goes through for shelter as cash. So there's a lot of interesting processes around that, particularly in urban areas where it largely works with rental support. I'll encourage all our participants to please go to the Easy Retro link and add in some questions for Saoirse there, please. And in the meantime, I'll revert back to you, Aditi. I know that you may have to leave early for an urgent meeting, and if that's the case, I want to get in a couple of quick key questions to you first. And I've gathered some from the questions that have been posted online. Interestingly enough, you've mapped out some of the bigger picture issues from which the humanitarian approaches and our stakeholders fit in, and how they relate to these global shifts. Certainly, with your expertise in financing green approaches, we know that the structural limitations in donor priorities and funding are very rigid, from development donors to humanitarian donors, and I think Saoirse touched on this as well. What hope, what ways, or what opportunities do you see for accessing funding around resilience, risk reduction, etc., for humanitarians, so we can better link what's happening before disaster and after disaster, so there's a more seamless kind of connection across processes? If you've got some thoughts on that, I think that that'd be helpful. That was one of the most voted for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. So I can, really, I sympathize with the question, and I can see where it's coming from. I think, climate and conflict hotspots really struggle to attract any kind of financing. And so for that, there is a real role for instruments such as guarantees to help bring in that kind of financing and make that connection. I think the local access to resources to those most in need is critical. And for that, particularly on climate finance, there's been a huge push to try and scale up capacity building for enabling different communities and different partners to be able to access climate finance. And I understand that there are particularly climate-related financing instruments that are being developed for targeted adaptation resilience that are being pushed through things like the Green Climate Fund and the Climate Investment Fund, and there are very specific vehicles for this. But we cannot count. These are not immediately making the links with the humanitarian community, and I think that the emphasis there has to be on connecting better with the ex post rebuilding, but also the preventative the ex-ante resilience building that we have been, I mentioned earlier. We cannot also count humanitarian finance under the $100 billion that is going on climate. So there is a much more that needs to happen to make sure these processes and work streams coordinate and align going forward. But this is, this is where the development community, the climate community, and as we push for this breakthrough on adaptation and resilience as you better integrate climate risk and try to align prioritization of investments in this space. Hopefully that ex ante and ex post investment and planning can come together.
Thanks very much, Aditi. And maybe a follow-up and link to that really is in your introductory comments, you mentioned, some of the key shifts that have taken place. I think all of us online would see that as well. Climate action, climate change issues are front and center of the media. I mean, of course, of our work as well, but they're much more present. And we can all see this escalating. In the last 12 months, there's been, some significant kind of geopolitical shifts, changing global leadership and recognition. You mentioned specifically about COP26 coming up in 6 months. What is your hope for that? What do you think could be the best possible kind of outcomes, or maybe the more realistic outcomes that we could hope for? And how do you think it'll affect the work of people like us? How would that translate through to changes in the humanitarian system? And then Saoirse, I'll cross to you for maybe some thoughts on that as well, and linkages through to the relationship between climate and conflict. Thanks, Aditi. I think you're on mute.
If I don't hear that at least once in every meeting, that I know that something's going wrong. So I think one of the things that I COP26, as I mentioned, we're pushing on the Secretary General is pushing on 3 priorities. He wants to see enhanced NDCs being submitted by countries that are aligned with the global push towards net zero emissions by 2050, keeping that 1.5 degree goal within reach. So what we hope is that countries that have set these mid-century goals will submit enhanced NDCs that sort of put that intermediate trajectory to 2030 that is aligned with that 2050 objective. In addition, we really, really need to see follow through on the $100 billion commitment. This is a matter of not just trust, but it is, this was a commitment that was originally made in 2009 and codified in the Paris Agreement. And we really do need to see that follow through. And then also to get a sense of the trajectory on climate finance going beyond this 2020-2021 phase, but moving beyond to what will be the climate finance commitments out from 2021 to 2025. So that's another big thing. But in addition, as I mentioned, the adaptation resilience piece is critical, and the Secretary General has been calling on G7 countries and others to step up on adaptation and resilience and use their platform to make sure that 50% of climate finance is going towards adaptation and resilience. We need to see a breakthrough that will, deliver on that 50% of climate finance. We'd like to see rules that increase and improve access to climate finance especially for the most vulnerable. He has been calling for better integration of climate risk into all investment policy, procurement, and budgetary decision making. The scaling up of regional climate initiatives and the strengthening and development of both ex-ante and resilience building instruments, financing instruments, and ex-post catastrophe triggered financing instruments. So if we can see a breakthrough along those lines, I think that will set provide a necessary push on adaptation resilience that is critical going forward. And then I think you had just flagged that on the built environment piece, COP will be having a built environment day, and we would like to see how the global shelter cluster can contribute to a sea change in the resilience of homes and communities going forward.
That's great to hear. Thanks very much, Aditi. Saoirse, I'll just cross over to you now, and I want to get your thoughts, and maybe related to the final point that you had before, but really this relationship between humanitarian action and the kind of nexus with climate change and conflict. You know, just as a background, most of the activated shelter clusters at field level are now in conflict contexts. And we find ourselves working in the context of protracted conflict. I mean, Syria is a case point, but also widely through the Sahel, through East Africa, where you've had a lot of your experience, through West Africa, Great Lakes, both on the IDP side and the refugee side. And there is this inextricable link. Can you maybe just give us your thoughts on how you see that, what your research in the past and up to date has presented, and what is the position of ODI in terms of policy approaches or other actions that we can look at or link to kind of help us navigate, you know, the crossroads of these very complex issues?
Yeah, well, thanks, Brett. I mean, I think conflict and fragility is the missing element in some of these climate conversations, and you're right in terms of the complex crisis and context that you're dealing with in the cluster, that they represent the real areas of humanitarian need currently. And just to kind of put that, I guess, into a broader perspective, and you asked for a bit of inspiration. I'm afraid these aren't very inspiring statistics. And we started 2021 with, a series of really unhappy records. We started with the highest levels of humanitarian need on record, at 237 million people in need. Record levels of internal displacement. I don't need to tell you that. And the highest humanitarian appeal on record. It was $26 billion in total. And this is exactly the reasons for, what you've painted, that there are needs in protracted conflict, complex emergencies that are, often the majority of which are 8 years plus, and they've been compounded by COVID. And we know that COVID has, resulted in the largest global recession since the 1930s, and it's bringing reversals and developments and new forms of vulnerability, kind of new poor that are likely to be urban, better educated, and less likely to work in agriculture than those in extreme poverty before COVID-19. And so this is the picture we're in currently. And I was at an event yesterday at the FCDO where they were predicting out for the next 4 years, so until 2025. And the picture is one that's going to worsen dramatically. So in 4 years' time, it's likely that need will rise further, somewhat between 7 and 15%. And that the gap between humanitarian resources and need, which is currently at about 50%, will rise up to between 65 and 70%. And the reason for this is climate. That climate-related risks will overtake COVID as a driver of compounding risks. So alongside conflict and the protracted crises that you're talking about, that climate will become one of these multi-dimensional and compounding risks in areas already of acute vulnerability. And it will affect different regions differently. And so the exposure might be greater in some, if you want to call them non-humanitarian contexts in South Asia. Multi-dimensional vulnerability in humanitarian settings will mean that the impact will be dramatically higher. And we can see this, for instance, from South Sudan, where flooding last year displaced over 400,000 people. So that the shocks and the events themselves might not be as hazardous, but their effect in vulnerable, fragile environments are absolutely dramatic. And so what does this mean for the humanitarian system and I guess the cluster system specifically? Some are arguing a back to basics approach, that in a context of ever expanding and more complex compounding risks that humanitarians need to prioritize, and they really need to prioritize on those areas of acute need and focus in on real life-saving approaches and narrow their approaches. I think otherwise, and I think that if we want an aid architecture system that's more fit for purpose for these complex and compounding risks, we need to go beyond supporting international actors to respond, and we need to take a much more system-based approach to climate risk, which involves national governments, private sector, development partners, and to a certain degree humanitarian agencies that are working together to do what Aditi was talking about in terms of preparing and managing risk, adapting and ensuring resilience over the longer term, and ensuring that there is a much more nationally embedded and systemic approach. And so what does this mean? It means, first of all, working much more closely with development actors, and we know they're already very much engaged in crises, particularly the international finance institutions and the World Bank. And you can see this, for instance, with IFIs providing 17 times as much financing to the humanitarian response plan for COVID than actual humanitarian donors did. And this means that we need to work much better with them, not just as funders, but actually as key strategic and operational actors in crisis settings. And they too have responsibilities. So one thing that we've seen from our work is just the real limits in terms of leadership and coordination that actors like the World Bank have in these conflict and complex contexts. And so they need to adapt in terms of their skills of working in complex emergencies. But we need to adapt as well. We need to be co-designing solutions with development actors over the longer term, and to be thinking, as the shelter cluster, about these protracted complex environments and how are we, designing our solutions with long-term approaches in mind. It means working much more with national actors and national systems. And I know, this is bread and butter in many ways for you within the shelter cluster. But in what way, have we got to the point where we're really facilitating and enabling national solutions rather than coordinating with national actors? And I think we are to a degree, but I think we can go much further. And I think it really means prioritizing those areas of distinct added value for international humanitarian actors. I think there's a real risk that when we hear, the sums that Aditi is talking about, that international humanitarian agencies see this as an opportunity and see climate risk as a vehicle into which they can expand their operations. But they have a role. But I don't think every problem has an international humanitarian organization solution. And I think climate risk is one of those areas that we really do need to think about kind of sustainable, nationally embedded solutions. I think we need to think about do no harm in a much more expansive way. So we've heard about kind of greening UN operations. But I think in this context of risks, not just thinking about that in terms of the impact on climate warming, but also think about the risks of environmental destruction in and around humanitarian operations and how that plays into some of these dynamics that we already know exist in these environments in terms of, insecurity, in terms of violence. It means not substituting for national capacities and growing them over the longer term. And it means looking for climate smart solutions when we're undertaking our work. And I think we've heard a lot in terms of financing and how that needs to be targeted more to adaptation and resilience. But I do think that there needs to be much more careful work to think about how we can target some of that financing into highly insecure and conflict situations, because currently that's really the missing piece from this discussion. So I'll end that there.
Great. Thanks very much, Saoirse. I'll come back to you with some more questions. In the meantime, Ella and Angela, if you look through the online queries, if there's anything there that we can also apportion to Saoirse. And Aditi, I think that you must leave soon for your next appointment. I'll invite you to make any closing remarks before you have to depart.
So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Saoirse said, and I couldn't agree more on. But, you know, as I mentioned earlier, there is and will be a huge overlap between the climate and conflict hotspots, and the current famine risks for tens of millions is being driven by conflict, climate, and economic impacts also of the pandemic. And we need multi-hazard approaches. And need to expect that any type of crisis can be worsened and exacerbated by climate. And in that context, really agree with Saoirse on the systemic approach that is needed to dealing with this. But I also would like to say that the humanitarian community should coordinate to ensure that what they're doing in terms of recovery processes follow a low carbon pathway and are resilient to future impacts of climate change. For example, the way in which we rebuild communities disrupted by extreme weather can affect how they react to the next event. And so we need to build back better, which means investing in more resilient infrastructure. This can save money for communities and countries by reducing the cycle of rebuilding after each event and protect the lives and communities in the longer term. And just in terms of what Saoirse had talked about, you know, for example, in the case of resilience and the need for thinking about this in the context of disaster areas, but there's also the opportunity that they're thinking about this from the economic opportunity. For example, I recently read about the transition to solar power among Syrian refugees, driven not by people's desire for low emissions development, but by the high cost of diesel fuel and maintenance for generators and the availability of affordable solar panels as an alternative. You are all much better positioned to understand how best to sort of integrate resilience and longer term issues into the urgent demands of life-saving humanitarian response. But we are seeing market shifts that will make affordable power, more efficient and resilient housing, more risk-informed measures commonplace, inexpensive and available. And so everyone needs to be able to benefit from these gains, which can also support peace building efforts. So just wanted to make sure that I connected the dots there. But thank you so much for this excellent conversation and these great questions. And I hope the rest of the session goes well. And my apologies for having to bow out early, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Aditi. Much appreciated. We know you've got a very busy day ahead of you, so thanks for making time for us and for this important conversation. We will take you up on the offer of getting involved in COP26 when the time comes. So thanks a lot for that. And we wish you all the best. We'll keep in touch on these joint issues.
Absolutely. Thank you. And enjoy. Bye-bye.
Ella, I'll cross over to you and see if there's any questions that have come in on the Easy Retro. And also, in the meantime, I'd like to invite some of the colleagues, especially those that have joined from the field. I know we've got cluster coordinators online who are really working on the front line in places like Afghanistan. I can see Patrick. I think we've got Brice online from Burkina Faso. I'd also like you to kind of speak from your own current contexts and experience, and we can come up to maybe some questions from you a little later. In the meantime, Ella, have you got it? What are some of the highlights there? Can you sift through what are the ones that are getting highlights, high priorities? Where is the questions and queries going?
Okay. Clearly, our audience was quite inspired and intrigued by the interventions. Unfortunately, I think we have to call Aditi back for a full session because there are lots and lots of questions that were coming her way. So maybe we'll share the feedback with her at some point. I want to start with the two questions for Saoirse that got the highest number of votes. And not that the rest is not interesting, but let's just follow the numbers. So the first one is It reads, maybe we should change the way we use the term participation, rather aiming to see ourselves as participating in the affected people's recovery according to their stated ambitions and not the other way around. So, well, it's also more of a comment, of course, but...
Sorry, Ella, I didn't catch that.
Okay, so
you went offline in the middle.
It's the question is about how we understand the term participation, and the comment is whether we should be participating in people's recovery and not calling their decision-making process and recovery as them participating in ours. So I rephrased it a little bit. So if you would agree, and then how maybe we could enable that. That's the first question. And the second question is, who do you think is the most influential group of stakeholders to make the real change aimed by the World Humanitarian Summit? And then the other side of the medallion is who or which actions have been the biggest hindrance? You don't have to name anyone, but maybe from your observations. So I'll just start with these two and then see if the voting, okay, I feel like the song festival now. See the voting changes anything. Over to you, Sasha.
Okay, I love that first question, and I couldn't have put it better myself. We recently did a piece on participation, and I think our point there was that, you know, we see participation within the humanitarian sector as people participating in projects, and that's what participation is. So kind of about demand-driven humanitarian action. But actually, if you look at participation in our countries, participation is about kind of a political process. It's about agency and influence and voice. And yet we come into these environments and we set up these kind of parallel participation exercises and projects that in any case we don't respond to and activate if they don't end up changing what we do. You know, in many of the contexts that I've worked on and in some of the research that we've seen, when you ask people what they want, they talk about the fact that they want jobs, they want education for their kids, and they want access to technology and information. And then we say, well, sorry, you know, we've got some emergency shelter for you, or we've got some food for you. But, you know, so we're not, you know, on the first hand, I think we're understanding participation wrong, and we're, you know, at best asking for feedback on our projects rather than understanding and participating in people's recovery, as the questioner or the commenter put so well. And I think, you know, we looked at the proposal that Mark Lowcock put forward. I think it's called ICFIC. I can't remember what that stands for, but it's something about people's voices in crisis. And it's created a lot of debate. And I guess my own point on it, one of the points of criticism and debate is that it doesn't solve this issue about kind of upwards accountability into the system, and it creates a kind of a referee or an ombudsman and a final arbiter in the ERC and in this kind of in this group of independent stakeholders who will decide if what agencies are doing is the right thing. That it just compounds this upward accountability and doesn't actually support the type of participation that questioner spoke about. But I think we need to do both. I think actually the incentives within the system are completely wrong, and that agencies need to be compelled rather than encouraged to actually act on what people want. And I think at the moment, you know, the funding doesn't operate in that way. There's many other reasons why, you know, it's not possible when people say we want jobs and education and we want technology for us to adapt. But I don't think we're even close to that at the moment. So I think that's one issue. I do agree with the kind of sentiment in that proposal that was about kind of incentivizing through money and compelling through reputational risk agencies to conform more to what people in crisis need and want. But I think we also have a responsibility to think about participation in a much wider way. And I think that's about people in crisis and their representatives, whether they're national and local organisations, whether they're community representatives, having a much more direct say in what agencies do. And that's everything from people being employed within aid operations and projects, not just as volunteers or not just as incentive workers, but actually employed as workers, as managers, as decision makers in these operations that affect their lives. I think it's about more meaningfully bringing people into the coordination and decision-making processes. I think area coordination offers some benefits in that respect, so that we're actually engaging with a specific environment and a specific group and understanding their needs in a holistic way. But I think there's many other ways that we can think about participation as being something that is about voice and influence. And then I think it's about not setting up parallel and new participatory structures. So we come in with our, shelter projects and set up different ways of engaging communities in relation to that. It's about thinking actually what exists already in the community in terms of representation. It may not be perfect. We may think it's problematic from a gender point of view, from a, an ethnically biased point of view, but let's not, destruct the political processes that exist in these communities and try to create our own, because it's just counterproductive. And so let's actually engage much more with the development processes of participation that are ultimately about rights, about agency, about voice, and engage with those. And so I do think it is about us understanding our role as enablers and facilitators in terms of people's kind of survival and their recovery over the longer term, rather than, can I put up a letterbox next to my shelter and get some feedback, on the project that I've already decided is what you need. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but as you can see, it's a big area of engagement for us.
Yeah. And look, you've got the floor now as well, Saoirse, so that's also a good opportunity. I think that was really comprehensive. I mean, that's a real comprehensive view of participation in all its dimensions. You specifically mentioned something about financing, and you did earlier on as well, and certainly that's what Aditi had been focusing on, but she's really talking about kind of financing in at the kind of structural and systemic level, whereas I guess we're talking more about participation and the financial enabling aspects of that at the local level. We had a session on Tuesday in regards to Nexus, particularly in urban areas. And from a lot of our experience with our stakeholders in the cluster, especially in urban areas, is this big question of engagement of urban authorities. So the supporting and engagement of urban authorities. Now, in many crisis-affected areas, either where there is a physical damage to the environment or a large influx of population, whether it be conflict related or natural disaster driven, doesn't matter so much. But let's say we've got two contexts. One is a destroyed environment and the other is where there's been a population movement. When we have urban authorities, how do we meaningfully work with them when we have restrictions maybe from our agencies or from the donors on the channeling of funds? So if the funding aspects are the prevention to better localized participation and engagement, can you identify any ways we can get past that impasse where we have a lot of conditionalities around how funding's used? Because for all of us, we've discussed these issues to a fair degree, but we're still stuck within a fair number of boundaries of our own financial rules and regulations and systems and donor requirements, etc. Have you seen any glimmers of hope? Do you know of any scenarios where there has been, proper cooperation with local authorities, local communities, including financial transactions?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I definitely don't have the silver bullet for this. I guess what I would say is that I think, there are enough conversations like the ones that I'm talking about kind of the need for a paradigm shift for donors to now begin to think seriously about what they're calling de-risking. So, if we do feel that there are opportunities for kind of a more systemic approach, and that is not only going to be kind of more sustainable and more appropriate, but I guess in their point, more efficient probably over the longer term, then how do we actually finance that? And I think in terms of what we've seen in terms of shifts, but I think it's been mainly shifts to national organizations, is a much more kind of readiness to think through kind of new solutions, whether it's country-based pool funds, whether it's local intermediaries and networks providing financing in a way that allows donors to demonstrate fiduciary duty to their parliaments and their publics, while also being able to provide much more funding at a local level. I think it's much more difficult when it's local government, and particularly local government in conflict situations. And I think that's one of the real concerns that I have about the climate discussion, is the climate discussion seems to be kind of conflict agnostic. And when you look at the climate financing is not going into the Syrias, it's not going into the Yemens, it's not going into the Darfurs, and the context that we know that climate is compounding already, protracted and complex environments. And so what does that mean actually about you working with, what can be quite positive technical relationships at a subnational level? So there can be opportunities to engage municipal governments. There can be opportunities to engage district governments on quite a technical level, where there isn't a huge transfer of funds and there isn't a huge transfer of risk, and there's a kind of a positive engagement. And I would have thought that actually trying to better unpick those opportunities and demonstrate those potentials, albeit kind of ones that are, I guess, quite carefully controlled, would be positive. I think we saw, and I know it's very different, but kind of my experience is looking at refugee environments, where we are working in more stable environments and not in conflict situations, but a real recognition of the role of governments in contexts where maybe the overarching national policies were not very favourable, but district and municipal governments kind of going a bit rogue on the refugee approach, just pragmatically. It's like, well, you say that we don't accept and include refugees, but I happen to have 500,000 in my district, so I need to do something about it. And then kind of funding and engagement with international actors in quite a controlled way was made possible, and I think opened up actually much more positive discussions around refugee engagement and around the role of municipal and district government in refugee management. And I think we need to get towards those kind of more pragmatic solutions. They will be very case by case. They might have to be extremely politically informed and nuanced about the kind of actors and the context in which we're operating, because we won't be able to kind of have the same solution in one environment to the next. But I do think we need to get towards those type of solutions where we understand that actually in this, secondary city, actually we can work well with the municipal authorities, and there are opportunities for some controlled risks that could be beneficial over the longer term. But yeah, I don't have the silver bullet, which I think is a really complex and difficult set of issues.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Saoirse. I mean, absolutely. There was a session last week, and it was also reflecting on the high-level panel that's been set up for IDP. There was a side event to that looking at urban displacement, and there was a strong recognition coming through about these secondary cities and the issues that you just picked up. Then, Ella, I'll get you to please also take a look at the board and see what
I think I might have missed off the second question in my very long-winded discussion about participation. Okay. But about who are the most influential group of stakeholders, is that on the
exactly?
Yeah, on the grand bargain.
Yes. So yeah, I will just repeat it. Who you think is the most influential group of stakeholders to make the real change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on which issue. I think, and in which way. I mean, I think if you think about cash, that kind of revolution that we've seen, that has really taken hold, I think, in the last maybe 5 to 7 years in terms of just that transition and that acceptance, not just that transition and acceptance, actually that change into cash delivery. That came on the back of, because I know we were involved in them, just repeated evidence reviews demonstrating that cash was possible in conflict situations, repeated engagement by different actors. I think, DFID was one of the primary actors on that. They really pushed cash, but then got other donors involved. There was a series of different kind of aid agencies that were demonstrating the use of cash. And then it took hold. And so we got to the point of the World Humanitarian Summit. And I think the Grand Bargain was just one of a number of mechanisms that reinforce that. So I think in terms of, if you wanted to look at kind of localization, who are the key actors there? I think on localization, localization I feel is at the point where we were with cash kind of almost 7 years ago, that it's been accepted as a norm, for some inevitable. But we've just done a big evidence review on what does the evidence say about the relative effectiveness of local action relative to international action. And it's a bit of a cyclical argument, because unless local actors are given the money and the finances to actually implement, then of course they can't have impact, and so they're not there yet. But at the same time, I think the debate is still very much a normative debate around the ethics of this, around the supposed sustainability of this, around kind of civil society solutions. Actually, the evidence isn't there. And so we need to really kind of work on developing evidence on local action. And on local action, you have, extremely powerful and vocal local actors, which I think are making a really strong case. I think you have some solidarity-based INGOs, so largely the faith-based INGOs with independent funding and means to actually support local responders in a different way. And then increasingly you have donors. So the Australians have put local action as their #1 humanitarian priority under their new strategy. We've been asked by the Dutch, by the Danish, by ECHO to provide support for them on their development strategies and how to incorporate kind of more effective policy and support for local responders. So, I mean, I think there is interest and there is movement. I think the big blockage there, to be really frank, is our UN agencies. I don't think we're seeing the same momentum amongst UN agencies. And then I think on things like quality financing, which is the big one for the next grand bargain, you know, I think everyone loves to moan that the donors haven't played their part on that, but actually, and I don't have the figures to hand, but you know, the report talks about the big advances that, you know, some of the smaller donors have made. The Nordics in particular are way out front with the Dutch and the Irish to a certain degree. But actually what we see there is that until the US, the EU and DFID change their approach, and Germany to a certain degree, they're the big donors, that the picture isn't going to change in terms of more predictable and kind of flexible quality financing. But there is small policy moves on all of their parts, particularly towards country-based funds, which means that they're, yeah, I guess over the next 2 years, I can imagine there being quite a big change in terms of quality funding. I think they are looking for ways to advance that. But the big issue there, it will be about whether that quality funding actually is directed into the places and the actors that are best placed to respond effectively in different crises. So kind of going back to that point, Brett, that you had about, you know, if we see national actors as being really important in specific context, how would some of these kind of aid effectiveness changes actually advance some of those agendas in the places and with those actors that need it most? And I think, you know, direct funding to national governments in conflict situations, it'll be a very long way off until we crack that element of it.
So
Thanks
maybe
very much, Saoirse.
shall I comment with because there's one comment that also received quite a lot of votes, and it's in a way maybe a step towards the more practical side for us, but very much still linked to policies and maybe how we need to frame some of our arguments also towards other stakeholders and our donors. So the question is how to frame the arguments for more expensive, so durable solutions versus the less expensive but more traditional and emergency solutions. So it's a little bit also the issue of coverage versus quantity, and whether there are any policies developed to support advocacy for more durable solutions on the field level that you have seen, and maybe could give us some tips on how to also pitch that from the shelter and housing and living environment of people.
Gosh, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to answer that question, because I'm not kind of luckily in the difficult situation of having to make these pitches to donors for these types of kind of, I guess, longer term shelter solutions. I guess from my point of view, I guess, and again, I go back again always to kind of my displacement experience is where I've seen this working in terms of kind of longer term durable solutions and approaches has been in context where the case has been made. So Somalia is one example, for instance, where I think there have been actually quite, you know, quite strong steps in terms of longer term shelter solutions, and a recognition actually that the context is such in terms of, you know, long-term displacement and protracted displacement of IDPs and refugees, in terms of there being a kind of a major kind of issue of conflict and marginalization around return populations and how that is compounding kind of processes of exclusion. And I think the involvement there of the World Bank as a development actor in that environment, both from a governance point of view, but also from a displacement point of view, and making the case for kind of durable solutions that are kind of regional, but Somali specific, has been really instrumental in that kind of broader opening up of an environment where I would imagine, I'm not the person that has to go to those donors and make a case for funding, but you know, I've seen those shelters, so they must have been successful. So I think that has been very influential. I think also the conflict dimension, the fact that there is a recognition that there was a need to sort out the expansion of what are effectively new cities in Somalia in a way that's conflict sensitive and in a way that doesn't continue the kind of protracted internal displacement situation there. So I think there's a confluence of different kind of arguments coming together in places like Somalia. There's also been a distinct emphasis of durable solutions as kind of an agenda in of itself that's allowed for, I guess, more innovative approaches than I've seen elsewhere. But I'm not a shelter expert, but I do feel that it is about those kind of conditions being right for donors to feel like this is a good bet, and that it's part of a wider process, and not that they're just funding a kind of an innovative shelter approach, but it's part of an overall strategy for a place like Somalia.
It is actually,
but you know much better than I do.
The durable solution strategy for Somalia, it's been a really quite successful process, you know, amongst different actors, but certainly the municipal authorities in Mogadishu have really stepped up, and they've made this recognition that we're not really regarding these, you know, people as IDPs. They're just part of a vast urban poor. And that comes back to a comment in the high level panel as well, that when IDPs are displaced to urban areas, after some time, their needs become the same as the majority of the urban poor, where it's about access to services, access to land, access to decent living conditions, and looking at people from a status versus needs debate becomes a little pointless in the end. So I agree, Somalia is a very good example, and there's quite a bit about that online. It's been a joint process there, and there's a good path ahead. I know, Saoirse, we've got about 5 minutes left, and in terms of allowing you a moment for maybe collecting your thoughts and giving us a kind of final comment, and then Ella will do some closing remarks. In advance of that, I thought we would have a live question. I see that Noor, you've got your hand raised. Noor, would you like to make some comment or question for Saoirse? Thanks.
Yes, I just wanted to back Saoirse on the question that she's asked regarding the proposals. So I think, from my perspective, if you provide the evidence in your proposal that longer term shelters, durable shelters, are better than shorter term, the donors might be interested. We did a research paper at the University of Bath, and we investigated 81 designs from around the world, and we studied it both for the short-term shelters and the longer-term shelters. So if you do a life cycle analysis of the durable shelters, they are much better than these 6 months, 8 months, or 2 years design life shelters. So it comes back to bridging the gap between the research and the practice. So if we provide such evidence in our proposals to the donors, I think the climate impact or the environmental impact is a strong case for the donors to be convinced. And Somalia in Afghanistan is also a very good example. I worked there for 5 years. All the shelters that we were building, I was the shelter officer there, were called semi-permanent shelters, although they were almost permanent houses that we were building, but we couldn't call them permanent houses just because of donors. The donors will not support, they will not provide funds if you call them houses. You have to call them shelters, and you have to put the semi-permanent there in the name of the. So I hope it's now changing, and durable shelters are definitely, in terms of environmental impact, much better. So if we can have this in our proposals, probably we might have a chance of getting the fund.
Good point, Noor. Absolutely. There's a lot in the name, isn't there? The terminology that we use. Thanks very much, Noor. I think that's a good example. Sorsha, I know we've got only a couple of minutes left. I'd like to give you an opportunity just to kind of wrap up. I mean, luckily you had a good chance to get your message across, to highlight some key things. Just in another minute or so that we have left, would you be able to maybe make a couple of points of what you see some of the critical issues to be, understanding that we have shelter coordinators, shelter practitioners online. This is your chance to speak to them. What would you like them to know? What would you like them to keep as priorities going forward? And I'll just give you a minute or so to wrap up with some thoughts on that. Thanks very much, Sorsha. Then we'll cross to Ella.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really is to pick up on your Nurella's point there about the funding situation may not be that enabling, but trying to find innovative ways of selling kind of sustainable, climate smart, to the degree possible, environmentally friendly solutions. You have the expertise. I mean, you know what makes sense from a kind of a local production point of view, from a local market point of view, but also in terms of kind of what solutions are relevant for those communities and for those environments. And so trying to kind of promote those solutions that work over the longer term. But I think one of the real risks I see in relation to climate is that, it is one of these areas, and we're all guilty of it, where we hear about those financing that's coming on stream. And I would argue that it's not coming on stream to the right places, and not coming into kind of conflict in climate places and coming up with these solutions that we require for those, but that we don't kind of presume that the solution is an international humanitarian solution, and that actually that we understand that these are complex and long-term processes and we can play a role in them. But actually it's not about us, and actually how do we enable our national partners, how do we enable those municipal authorities that you have good relationships with, to be understood as more at the forefront of this, and for us to be taking more of a back role, and not substituting as this area opens up more. So I think there will be important roles, there will be the mega disasters that emerge out of these climate risks, where international agencies will have to play a really important role. But in terms of those mitigation and adaptation strategies, they need to be nationally embedded. So we need to configure ourselves in relation to those.
Sorsha, from my side, thank you very much. You've really painted a very detailed picture and connected a lot of issues from the policy side, the research side, gaps on the grand bargain approach outcome, but also some successes. And I'm really glad that we actually had the time to go through some of these detailed issues around participation, localization, at the forefront. And from your policy and research position, I think you've got a particular angle that's actually really helpful for the practitioners and the coordinators, because we do focus on our technical approach sometimes. It's important for us to step back and see these connections. So I'll finish from my side. I'll hand over to Ella, but from my side, I'd like to warmly thank you for your time, for your energy, for your wise words. They've been very helpful, and I hope that's not the last conversation that we have with you. Thanks a lot.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, so there are not that many closing remarks left to say, actually, because it's been a very clear and enjoyable discussion. What I see, of course, is that we have been having already a series of sessions. This is the 4th day in our annual meeting, which is actually quite encouraging, is that despite the fact that we have been looking at different topics, seemingly different topics, the key messages that seem to come out and learnings are quite similar. As Brett was mentioning, we had a discussion on the nexus. We have been having more technical discussions, and time and again, what I'm hearing is for us, also as cluster, but also as international agencies, how we need to rethink our position. We are not the solution, we are just part of a solution. And then our aim, probably our ultimate objective, needs to become facilitators and enablers, and not just the service provider, just being there in the making the right connections. I think this is also this was the underlying message also in today's panel. We also need to adapt. Everybody has to adapt to new roles and to one another. And you also mentioned, of course, Sosha, that we need to be really rethinking the way we support the national actors and systems, and we need to trust the national actors and systems that they will be also doing the right thing in their own context. It may not be the path or the solution that we think of, but it's going to be the one that will have a more durable effect, I think. And I really also would like to, I'm not so sure who put this comment, but the person who asked the question about the participation, it's the most voted question and comment. So I think it really touched a very important point. So also thank you to our colleague for challenging us in that participation comment. So it's really us participating and being a small part in other people's recovery, and not the other way around. So I think with that, we will be closing this session, and thank you so much. We put you a bit maybe, Sosha, in the on the spot, but I think it was a real privilege for us to be able to pick your mind on a number of things that keep us busy. And thank you everyone for the participation and the good questions. So this is today's is the last day of our annual meeting this week. So we still have a couple of open sessions later today, but tomorrow we're taking a break to be able to maybe answer our emails and do all the other work that has not been taking place. And we will again start, of course, on Monday. We also have a very interesting session on greening the response. So really looking at more the green side. And of course, there are lots of open sessions. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Sosha, and of course, Aditi in her absence. And everyone for being part of this really good conversation.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.